Howdy, howdy. How's everybody doing? I hope everybody's having a good Friday. Um, while we wait on people to gather. What's up, Justin? Spider Dog. Sherry. Hope everybody is ready for a good weekend. A lot of people here got some snow, not down this far south. Let's start by doing this while we're waiting on people to gather. Let's do something light-hearted. Well, these weren't as good as the ones I had earlier. Anyway, I just wanted to play a minute. Hey, Kathy. Thank you. Thank you. Hey, Mr. Carey. Good to see you.
So scary.
All right. Let me get this. A little bit of this. A little bit of that. Okay. So since it's been a day or two, and the Culper ring has been moved back again. Oh, no worries, Mr. Carey. It's kind of a passion project of mine. Um, we were talking about the increases of issues with veterans and in crime, self deletions. Uh, and the like since the longest wars. Sorry. Thank you. Thank you. Yeah, remember to like and share. Hey, Mrs. McCall. I just sent you a message. I was checking on you. You seemed a bit out of sorts last night. So, uh, anyway, so I'm going to go back just a little bit to this colon here. Freedom fighter, good to see you, sir. Um, domestic violence cases across the Army rose 50% between 2008 and 2011, while incidents of child abuse climbed 62%. Oh, as I was saying, so the Culper ring's been moved back. Snow days and everything have given Wally some headaches with scheduling and stuff. So we will we'll get to it. I promise. I promise. So yeah, we'll get there. The weather has all kinds of stuff messed up. Everybody from up north of me has been sending me pictures of all the snow, and I'm just kind of jealous. all we got was some rain. So by 2010, almost 4,000 military personnel from all services were hospitalized for attempting or threatening suicide. Yeah, sometimes the Adderall don't work too well. That year, 280 active duty reserve and Army National Guard soldiers died by suicide, along with 15 military family members. Suicides among women veterans rose 40% between 2000 and 2010. Suicides among comparable non-veteran women rose only 13% during that period. By 2010, suicides per 100,000 had risen to 35.9 for veterans, nearly 3 times the civilian suicide rate of 12.4. But it wasn't until June 2013 that the full extent of the psychological damage became evident. In a detailed analysis by the Armed Forces Health Surveillance Center, it found that the most frequent diagnosis for patients medically evacuated from Afghanistan for treatment between 2001 and 2012 was not traumatic amputation or blast injury, but adjustment reaction. A medical diagnostic code that includes anxiety, depression, and acute stress. Also high on the medevac list, patients with episodic mood disorders and dissociative somatoform disorders. In short, The military was experiencing moral injury on a scale that was both massive and unrecognized outside a small circle of researchers. America had been to war before. Why was this psychological wounding of troops so widespread? It was the new kind of warfare U.S. troops were facing, forms of conflict that began to surface when I was with the Marines in Somalia in 1993. It was evident in Chechnya in 1994 and Liberia in the late 90s. Chaotic, extremely violent conflicts fought by ruthless, often suicidal extremists who violated every Western concept of warfare. 3/4 of U.S. battle casualties in Iraq and Afghanistan were caused not by direct action, gunshots in a firefight, but indirectly by blast injuries from tens of thousands of landmines left over from decades of war in Afghanistan. Then, from booby traps or IEDs, these improvised devices were made from bombs and artillery shells looted from Saddam Hussein's arsenals in the lawlessness unleashed by the U.S. invasion. Later on in Afghanistan, IEDs were constructed of simple fertilizer and fuel packed in a bucket with stones or nails and scrap metal, and a detonator and buried with a simple trigger made of 2 sticks and discarded AA battery and a piece of wire. Such devices exploded anonymously, leaving the survivors with no one to fight back against. And because they exploded almost anywhere and without warning, the troops learned that each footstep in Afghanistan could ignite a fireball and shatter limbs. I attended an early mine awareness class in Afghanistan in January 2002, given by an Army explosive expert. He had just finished clearing mines from a dirt path that led from the runway at Bagram, which would become a major U.S. base. Days later, he walked the same path, and a landmine that had worked its way up through the mud detonated and severed his leg. Danger in these wars was like that. Random and often deadly, leaving troops constantly in dread of or resigned to the sudden blast that would shear off arms and legs, rip through soft bodies, crush organs and bone, and drive dirt, rocks, and filth deep into torn flesh, often leaving the genitals shredded or missing. Several soldiers and Marines told me they'd rather be dead than live without one of their genitals and sex. Often, it was the first question the wounded would ask as they awoke from surgeries. Do I still have my nuts? But by 2012, several hundred soldiers and Marines were listed with the genitourinary wounds. Genitourinary wounds. These new wars also threw young troops into legal and moral swamps. Hey, hey, Jefe, the boss of the high seas. No, I know you're tired. You've been burning the candle at both ends the last few days. That GIs of the past wars could hardly imagine. Certainly, men have caused atrocities in every war. World War II saw war crimes of unimaginable horror. Atrocities in Vietnam were rare, but they happened. And for the most part, they were part were prosecuted. Generally speaking, though, soldiers on all sides of 20th century conflicts fought under common understandings that prisoners were not shot, for instance, and civilians were not considered targets. But in the alien world of combat in Iraq and Afghanistan, the enemy used the tactics of atrocity at will, the last century signpost of behavior. The Geneva Conventions and the laws of war seemed to disappear in the fiery blasts of IEDs and suicide vests worn by women and teens that killed and maimed indiscriminately in places like civilian markets and mosques. At ground level in these wars, the insistence of higher headquarters that American troops play by those old rules seemed quaint and irrelevant, even dangerous. A young infantryman, for instance, might watch an idle Afghan villager scope a crowd with binoculars, then dial a cell phone seconds before an IED exploded in a crowded market. But the infantry might hesitate to take the shot as the spotter fled. Appearances to the contrary, he could be an innocent civilian, non-combatant, protected under international law, or he could be part of an IED gang and kill again. Complicating these choices were the increasingly strict rules of engagement, or ROE, issued on plastic laminated cards to every military service member in Iraq and Afghanistan by a U.S. Central Command, the regional military headquarters. The rules governed by the circumstances in which deadly force could be used. The ROE, backed up by the threat of court martial if they were violated, demanded that every armed serviceman and woman make a tangled legal calculation while trying to stay alive and kill the enemy. That calculation generally required a positive ID or a PID of potentially threatening person as an actual legal enemy. Thank you, Boston. I appreciate it. That meant making a determination that someone is engaging in hostile act or demonstrating hostile intent. According to the ROE, in Iraq, families were allowed by U.S. occupation authorities to keep an AK-47 at home. The rule was changed during the summer of 2003 to allow 3 weapons. What's up, Joey? That sometimes puts soldiers in the dangerous position of trying to determine if some guy down the alley at dusk was holding a weapon in a threatening manner or just carrying it home. Whether his intent was hostile, whether he was about to open fire. For an American soldier, guessing wrong could mean court-martial or death. Nomad, how you doing, bud? In Afghanistan, the row were tightened further under the counterinsurgency strategy of General Petraeus and McChrystal to provide greater protection for civilians. The practical effect was to transfer some portion of risk from Afghan civilians onto guys like Darren Doss and Stephen Canty. Marines told me that when Taliban fighters realized that the Americans couldn't shoot back, unless they were holding a weapon demonstrating hostile intent. The Taliban sometimes would shoot and then throw down the weapon, knowing the Marines probably wouldn't fire back. And if a military police soldier serving as a turret gunner in a gun truck felt her position was under attack by a car speeding toward her, for instance, she was supposed to employ a process of escalation of force that required shouting, waving a flag, or blowing a whistle. If that didn't work, then brandishing a weapon, then firing a warning shot, then shooting for the tires, and only then shooting the kid. Can't imagine. My emergencies and issues are straight up, and you know what the issue is. I can't imagine having to sit and evaluate possible issues. So, very, very much so. All that was supposed to happen in seconds. The enemy, of course, had no such rules, giving rise to the burning conviction of many grunts that they were fighting with a huge disadvantage imposed by hire, sitting in far off, immaculate air conditioned offices. Justified or not, the row caused frustration and bitterness among the working class. Mike D. Surprised last night after finding your channel through Here Pirate. Glad I found G2 in the raw. Got to get ready for my second job, and we'll catch this later. Thank you, Mike B. It's understandable that the Surgeon General's 2006 report found that 10% of soldiers and Marines acknowledged to military researchers that they modified their row in order to accomplish the mission. Hella cereal. And it was like finding man bear pig to wade through it sometimes. But even attempting to follow the rules could lead to sickening self-recrimination. Lieutenant Colonel Rob Campbell, a tall officer with sandy hair and freckles, commanded a cavalry squadron in eastern Afghanistan when we talked during a foot patrol outside the city of Gardez in 2009. We were picking our way through ankle-high weeds, keeping one eye on the horizon for snipers, while also scanning the ground for telltale detonation wires or the fresh dirt of a newly buried IED. One night, Campbell said, overhead surveillance that was beamed into his command center showed what looked like a team of insurgents planting IEDs beside a road. He and his staff watched until they were certain that the row and international law had been satisfied and then called in a strike. The dead men turned out to be local farmers engaged in midnight planting. It was horrible, something I'll have to live with, Campbell said with anguish on his angular face. In Garmsir, Afghanistan, on the sweltering afternoon in 2008, when a RPG suddenly swooshed overhead and detonated, none of the Marines of 1-6 was hurt, but they boiled up like angry wasps, taking positions behind a wall and peering at a distant ridge line, where two Afghan teens were riding a motorbike back and forth, watching us. The Marines were certain the two either had shot at us or were signaling to a hidden shooter. But unless the Marines could see a weapon, they had to hold fire. Staring intently through their rifle scopes, they could see no weapon. "We got PID," someone demanded. Come on, pick it up," another Marine kept urging, convinced the RPG launcher lay just out of sight at the youth's feet. Eventually, the two moved off on the motorbike, and the disgruntled Marines returned to pick at their MREs. The rules seemed most difficult to interpret and follow at vehicle checkpoints, where often the most junior soldier or Marine was given the job of turret gunner, responsible for spotting and halting suspected suicide bombers. That's the situation Jake Sexton found himself in during his first combat deployment to Iraq in 2007. Jake had grown up in the crossroads hamlet of farmland and in the corn and soybean belt of eastern Indiana. Now he was a 20-year-old soldier with the Indiana National Guard, sitting atop a Humvee gun truck behind a 50 cal machine gun. Jake's dad, Jeff Sexton, told me the rest of the story as he came to understand it. Jeff is an Army veteran and a short haul truck driver. He runs air conditioner parts every day from Muncie down to the Honda plant outside Columbus. Late one April afternoon after work, he sat on his back porch in farmland and talked. His son, Jake, had spent 8 months in Iraq when he came home. I knew it was different, but it wasn't really that much different. But then, as things went on, he started opening up about Iraq a little more. He said in his slow, quiet voice, he told me about this situation where he was manning the turret, where they had this roadblock and a car came up and didn't stop. And so he had to open fire on the car. And when they went to investigate, it ended up being a family of 4. No weapons, just the miscommunication. Man, I remember this story. That really tore into him. He was the only one who fired, so there was no doubt he was the one that caused it. I said, "What did they do?" And he said, "Well, they had the investigation and said it was clear-cut cause of he had no choice." He said he didn't want to be back in the turret after that, and they took him off of it. He was home almost a year and a half before I knew that happened. Had Jake Sexton served in World War II, he would have had time to decompress with his buddies on the long trip home by troop ship. Soldiers coming home from Iraq and Afghanistan returned in a disorienting 2 or 3 days, as did Vietnam veterans. Hey, Misty. I have convoyed out of a combat forward operating base in Iraq, caught a ride to the Baghdad airport, flown to Kuwait, and on into a peaceful summer twilight of Washington, D.C., all in the same day. Active duty troops returned to Fort Hood, Texas, or Camp Lejeune with their buddies and stayed with their unit, more or less intact. But National Guard soldiers like Jake Sexton returned abruptly to civilian life, civilian friends, and civilian jobs, often with no one around who understood what they'd just gone through. And that added to Jake's problems. Come to find out, Jeff said, his son was having trouble sleeping and was drinking heavily and never was offered or sought the help of mental health experts. but he volunteered for another deployment, serving this time in Afghanistan on a quick reaction force, racing out every time someone hit an IED to secure the site and brace for the inevitable second attack. Mostly, Jeff understood it was Afghan civilians getting blown up. He had all kinds of pictures on his computers of the devastation and all that. It really bothered him, Jeff told me. He loved kids and seeing all these kids getting blown up. Jake came home on leave, and one afternoon he and his dad talked some in the garage with the little bit Jeff could get out of him. He could sense his son's anguish and frustration. As Jeff remembered it later, what was eating away at Jake was the senseless killing of innocent people, and then not knowing who you were fighting when it did happen. Like most soldiers, Jeff said he'd get a little alcohol in him and he'd open up a little bit. But any other time, he kept it all inside. A few days later, Jake and his brothers and other friends went to the movies at the Muncie Mall and to see horror comedy film Zombieland and settled in. After 20 minutes or so, Jake took a handgun and just shot himself in the temple and died instantly. He was 21 years old. Shattered, Jeff went to see the master sergeant in his son's unit and found out the sergeant knew Jake had PTSD. And I'm sitting there going, well, why didn't somebody say something? And it was, well, we can't interfere unless they step up, Jeff told me. And of course, the military code of honor is you don't admit the weakness and you don't ask for help. And Jake didn't. That wasn't okay, Jeff thought. So even before the funeral, he went back to Jake's National Guard unit and spoke to the assembled soldiers, urging them to see a mental health specialist if they felt they needed to, not to put it off. I went and told them flat out, if you've got a problem, to hell with suck it up, soldier, I said. Jake's buddies in Afghanistan had to do that because they still had a mission to do. But you guys are home now, and if you got a problem, it's time to take care of it. So step up. A couple of days later, Jeff got a call from the first sergeant. He thanked me for coming by, and he said he already had 3 guys step up and say they're having problems. And I told him, well, that's 3 less we got to worry about. But it's never not 3 less you got to worry about, right? You always have to worry. And I think New Year's kind of proved that to us. You have a mentally ill guy with all these issues that piled up on him. He decided to send a message. So we're coming up on the 21st year, and we don't seem to be getting any closer to solving these problems than we were. Okay. It wasn't as if the military brass and the Pentagon's vast civilian workforce in Washington didn't care about the psychological help of the men and women they were sending to war. True, they were primarily concerned with war fighting and with the daily drudgery of defense budgets, acquisition programs, and congressional appropriations, and the ceaseless politicking that went along with all of that. What made it difficult to find a way to tackle the issue of war trauma was the deep disagreements inside the mental health community about the very nature of trauma and what exactly was it. Hey, Michael. Um, I don't know if I agree with that statement either. I agree with the statement about the very nature of trauma, but the vast majority of the brass uh, thinking that they're agreeing that there's a problem. I do not agree that they care too much. Um, what we were talking about the other day with the just the kind of tongue in cheek conspiracy um, idea about what the VA is doing. Now we know that a PTSD rating that used to be was that was going to be 50% is now going to be 30%. Why is that important? Well, if you get rated 30% by military standards, if the formulary is going to be 30% with the VA, that's going to affect whether you're going to be able to be militarily retired, medically retired from the military or not. That's going to affect the person. Um, and then it's going to affect their pocketbook. And then that 30% is also going to affect where you stand in the queue of getting care at the VA. If that's your only rating, right? If you're only 30% for PTSD, well, that's you're going to be behind everybody that's from 100% probably down to 70%, and then the 50s and below. Uh, Angel Rivera would um, might be able to give a little bit better um, idea of what that is, but this is just something I heard this morning about the percentages, how they're going to be, and that's just the PTSD ratings. So your 70 is going to become 50, your hundreds become 70. This is anything that's filed from here moving forward. Your ratings are not in danger right now, but we're going backwards now. That's the point I'm trying to make. Um, Most people thought any kind of war trauma was simply post traumatic stress disorder. By the time of the terrorist attacks on 9/11, it had been 2 decades since PTSD had been officially recognized. The American Psychiatric Association, after studying psychologically damaged Vietnam veterans for over a decade, finally in 1980 certified post traumatic stress as an official disorder in its diagnostic and statistical manual of mental disorders used by psychiatrists in physicians, insurance companies, and government as the final word on illness. A diagnosis of PTSD, it said in the third edition, we're on 5 now, of the DSM published that year, must be based on the patient's experience of intense fear, terror, and or helplessness, must be re-experienced in recurrent intrusive dreams, flashbacks, or memories that provoke intense distress, and must cause the patient to react with emotional numbness or avoidance, staying away from fireworks, for instance, or isolating yourself from your family. Remember when we first started studying this in PTSD 1 and PTSD 2, we laid out the diagnostic criteria. You have to meet 4, and there's a lot of and ors in there. Um, so remember, it's just not one thing. Uh, he's put it succinctly here, but if you go back to PTSD 1 and 2 on the history and definitions of PTSD, you can find the um, a more in-depth analysis. You could get help from the military and VA therapists if you met those criteria. If not, good luck. While the public accepted PTSD as the explanation for all war trauma, inside the mental health profession, the view was far from unanimous. The view of what PTSD was were very confusing. Remember, also, you had the IIPI, who has a very much more well-defined definition and breakdowns of PTSD, complex PTSD, traumas, and everything else, but was not accepted by the DSM. So while the public accepted PTSD as the explanation for all war trauma, inside the mental health profession, the view was far from unanimous. The view of what PTSD was were very confusing. At least 50 blind men and an elephant, said Dr. Harold Cudler, a psychiatrist and chief mental health consultant at the VA. Nobody, for instance, agreed on exactly what constituted intense fear, since its intensity depended on the ability of the patient to articulate precisely how fearful he or she had been. That runs into a problem with veterans as well, right? We never want to talk about being scared. And some rejected entirely the idea that war trauma had to be fear-based. A lot of my friends who are major authorities got excited about fear, but I don't believe there is a great scientific basis to say that trauma is a fear phenomenon. Absolutely not. Fear is subjective, right? And you know what we got to be about being subjective. You got to be objective. I don't want to go into my whole spiel making fun of Todd on that one. Cudler said, when you boil PTSD down to fear, you're saying, oh, you were afraid? That's your problem. And I don't think that's the case. Under fire, the APA retreated. In its fifth edition of the DSM, published in 2013, it added that you could have PTSD if you were exposed to possible death directly or indirectly through the death of a relative, for instance. It turned out, Cutler told me, that even though fear and a feeling of helplessness made sense, it did not predict who would develop PTSD and put us back at square one. In a stunning acknowledgement, coming as it did after more than a decade of continual war, Cutler concluded, we do not know what trauma is. Linda, it's so sad that the VA is not doing anything that they should with PTSD and other issues that vets have. That's why I get so angry when these idiots go into VA centers to record them. Yeah, I mean it was a miscalculation, but I do understand the frustration that led to it as well. With one of those people. Others I don't know. But that's not the right way to fix the problem. Very gradually, it has become clear that the disturbing psychological effects that troops were experiencing in Iraq and Afghanistan were broader than any of the specific diagnostic specifications for PTSD laid down by the APA. The brass can't stand the fact that they can't see the injury and therefore have a hard time gathering the in. Yeah, it's. And like I talked about last time we were on this subject, you know, the it is more than a psychological injury. It is actually a physical injury to your brain. Oh yeah, Mrs. Metcalf. Let's see what they go through in Battlefield is way. Well, I mean, I think you would find it interesting to go back and listen to the rest of the PTSD and complex PTSD episodes, Mr. Carey. I'm not saying that just for watch time. I'm saying it from an educational point of view. Is uh, there is actually a lot of similarities um, when you dig down into it, especially with complex PTSD. As early as 1994, psychiatrist Jonathan Shea published his groundbreaking book, Achilles in Vietnam. We've talked about this before, which described the modern U.S. military as a moral construct, not because its actions are always moral, but because it is defined by shared expectations and values, Shea wrote. Even then, Shea could see that the moral codes that grunts really lived by did not rely solely on the military's own values and ethics that it demanded be memorized by recruits. Again, our values. I mean, probably, but it worries me too, Mrs. Metcalf, just because of the way it's going to be done coming out of the service and and input into IDES is it's worrisome. You know me, I can't trust the changes they make when it's lessening something. So let's see. Instead, he wrote, they combined some formal regulations, some shared traditions, and some generally accepted truths among warfighters about what is okay and what is not. Altogether, Shea wrote, these form a moral world that most of the participants, most of the time, regard as legitimate, natural, and personally binding. Moral injury, as Shea saw it in his decades of work with Vietnam veterans, was a violation of the collective and is, let's see, sorry, was a violation of this collective and deeply personal sense of what's right, not fear based trauma. I do not believe the official PTSD criteria capture the devastation of mental life after severe combat trauma, he wrote. In Shea's subsequent book, Odysseus in America, 2002, about veterans' homecoming, he writes of the moral dimension of trauma and complains with evident irritation that the APA's diagnostic manual was has saddled us with jargon. Post traumatic stress disorder, which sounds like an ailment, even though it is an evident form, it is evident from the definition that what we are dealing with is an injury. Well, I mean, I'm trying to just uh, flag these messages so we can have conversations when we finish reading. Okay. For instance, the moral injury of the soldier who saw his buddy liquefied. The accumulating evidence of war trauma made it more and more difficult to cling to the notion that most veterans experience psychological problems. Simply had PTSD. Researchers studying psychological autopsy data following military suicides, for instance, found that the majority of completed suicides did not meet the criteria for a DSM-4 disorder or PTSD at the time of suicide. Shira Magwin, the research and clinical psychologist at the VA in San Francisco, had published much peer-reviewed clinical research on the effects of combat, especially of killing. In her work, she found PTSD to be an important but minor part of war trauma. While the predominant view is that the majority of war zone traumas involve fear-based reaction to life-threatening situation, there is accumulating evidence that trauma types are far more diverse, involving a much wider range of emotions at the time of the trauma and varying post-trauma reactions in the aftermath, she wrote in 2013. The powerful emotions Darren Doss was feeling, for instance, when Kruger was shot, while the mental health community was struggling with simply define war trauma, the Pentagon and the VA were scrambling to find practical ways to respond to the psychological problems evident among the thousands of troops rotating home from war. In 2005, the Defense Department instituted mandatory physical and mental health screenings for soldiers back from deployment. The mental health portion of the 4-page checklist had items to check if you'd had frightening experience, were having trouble sleeping, or were easily startled. The Defense Department hired healthcare contractors to ask additional questions, including, have you ever felt you'd be better off dead? This post-deployment health reassessment was a start, but there was no system to track whether individuals who were flagged with serious mental health concerns ever got help. Many did not. There was a serious shortage of mental health specialists in the military services and at the overwhelmed VA, where the suicide hotline was drawing 170,000 calls a month. $170,000 calls a month, people. When the military could hire outside contractors to help, they often had no familiarity with the military and no insight into soldiers' lives. The experience of Mike McMichael, a North Carolina National Guard officer, was typical of those whom the military mental health system had failed. Mike is a stocky, well-muscled man whose commanding presence, friendly backwoods demeanor, and liquid Carolina diction camouflage a world of hurt and struggle. Thanks, Top. Appreciate it. Hey, Mr. Reekin. And he came home damaged with an undiagnosed traumatic brain injury from an IED blast and suffering nightmares, shame, and guilt over his experience. In an incident in 2004, a convoy he was commanding was trapped and ambushed north of Baghdad, and one of his fuel tankers was shot up and leaked fuel, which caught fire, engulfing Iraqi civilian bystanders. In his nightmares, the frantic bellowing of his soldiers, his own desperate struggle to get the convoy moving, and as he pushes his trucks through the wreckage, the screams of the Iraqi civilians shaking their fists at him as they burn. I appreciate it, Top. I do. I appreciate you being here. And self-reflection is a very important um, tool for us to use in our growth journey, even if you are, you know, old like us. On his return home, a military nurse gave Mike the checklist of PTSD symptoms. He filled it out and handed a copy back. He never heard from the Army. Years later, he looked at the copy he kept and realized he'd checked every indicator of severe traumatic stress on the sheet. Were you ever in fear for your life? Check. Felt hopeless? Check. Ever see bodies? Check. Ever see civilian injuries? Check. Anxious and sleepless? Oh, yeah, check. And so on. But Mike was never examined for psychological wounds and never got effective treatment. Over the ensuing years, he fought his memory lapses, tremors, fits of rage, blackouts, and anxiety attacks that left him gasping on the floor, occasionally screaming nightmares. He lost his job at the local power company and had to resign his commission as a National Guard officer. The unwritten warrior's code kept him from admitting his problems. I had guys that lost leg. What's wrong with me? That I can't handle this. There isn't anything really wrong with me. I didn't want to show weakness, he told me. He narrowly resisted the lure of suicide and eventually found a sympathetic psychologist at the VA. Intensive therapy helped. Now, Mike runs a program to train and certify veterans to become peer counselors for the VA. But life is continuing struggle, and his marriage has fallen apart. Such realities belied the feel-good rhetoric that had been coming from defense officials and generals. During a congressional hearing in the summer of 2006, I heard Big Jack Keane, a gruff, retired Army four-star general, reject the idea that the military was breaking under the stress of repeated combat deployments. I mean, I knew General Keane a bit. He was a big pusher of drones, so I interacted with him a lot. And yes, I would buy that he would say there was not a problem there. This is war, and we should expect stress and strain on our soldiers and Marines, he said dismissively. Despite that, he said, they are performing magnificently. True enough, perhaps, but that was a testament to their grit and determination, not to the troops' mental health. Amber Robinson, a sergeant with the 10th Mountain Division, told me later that summer about a friend who was killed in combat in Afghanistan. She had collected her friend's bloody clothes and personal gear and carried them all back to base. A lot of soldiers are depressed, angry, have drinking problems, she said. But you get desensitized. I don't cry anymore. After a few moments, she added in a soft voice, sometimes I wake and cry for no reason. As the wars ground on, the accumulating evidence of their psychological costs was causing concern among politicians on Capitol Hill for who began hearing demands for help from constituents with sons and daughters returning from Iraq and Afghanistan. Defense Secretary Donald Rumsfeld and other Pentagon officials were regularly lambasted in congressional hearing rooms for having rushed to war without providing proper armor, protection against IEDs, and for fumbling the response to the increasing mental health demands of troops at war. You go to war with the army you have and not the army you might want, was Rumsfeld's shrugging response. That October in 2006, Congress passed legislation requiring the Pentagon to expand the testing of troops before and after the deployment to war zones and to tighten its tracking procedures to ensure that troops flagged with mental health conditions like Mike McMichael be seen by mental health practitioners. The conclusions of a Defense Department task force on mental health, published a year later in June 2007, confirmed what many soldiers, Marines, and their families already knew, that the Pentagon's mental health services were woefully inadequate to meet the demand, unprepared 6 years after we went to war. Our involvement in the global war on terrorism has created unforeseen demands, not only on individual military service members and their families, but also on the Department of Defense itself. Which must expand its capabilities to support the psychological health of its service members and their families, the task force reported. New demands have exposed shortfalls in a healthcare system that in previous decades had been oriented away from wartime focus. Staffing levels were poorly matched to the high operational tempo, even prior to the current conflict. If y'all remember, the op tempo was pretty nuts with the K4 rotations going on, the continual rotations covering Southern Watch and Northern Watch, following 9/11 before we were. No, Southern Watch and Northern Watch were still going on. So, there was a lot going on, even though there was no um, real wartime demands. So we had a readiness problem then, not as we have now. I don't think. Top may beg to differ. I don't know. Um, but and and I think most people in here know my feelings on Donald Rumsfeld, but I do have to defend the statement is you do go to war with the army you have and not the one you may want. Should we have been at war in certain places? Y'all know my feelings on that too. So And the system has become even more strained by the increased deployment of active duty providers with mental health expertise. The system of care for psychological health that has evolved over recent decades is insufficient to meet the needs of today's forces and their beneficiaries, and will not be sufficient to meet their needs in the future. Things weren't much better over at the sprawling VA, where its 280,000 employees were struggling. Donald Rumsfeld was the Secretary of Defense under Bush Jr. when the war started. We're struggling unsuccessfully to keep up with the unanticipated demand by Iraq and Afghanistan war veterans for mental health services despite its $140 billion budget. Senior VA officials assured me things were fine, but in 2009, a coalition of veterans groups sued the VA, and the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Ninth Circuit agreed that the VA, because of inadequate mental health care and other medical lapses, had violated veterans' constitutional rights. It found the influx of injured troops returning from deployment in Iraq and Afghanistan had placed an unprecedented strain on the VA and has overwhelmed the system. As a consequence, the court determined veterans were forced to endure lengthy delays for treatment, especially for mental health care. Some, it found, had committed suicide. The VA's unchecked incompetence has gone on long enough, the court declared. No more veterans should be compelled to agonize or perish while the government fails to perform its obligations. Few veterans disputed the court's findings, but its decision eventually was overturned on constitutional grounds. The VA continued to sink. Its employees worked fast, but new benefits claims came in even faster. Between 2009 and 2013, the VA's clerks processed 4.1 million claims for benefits. But during that period, 4.6 million new claims came in the door. Eventually, VA officials were discovered lying to cover up their inability to handle the workload. And in 2014, Secretary of Veterans Affairs Eric Shinseki, General Shinseki, who got fired by Bush, a decorated combat veteran, was forced to resign. That's the second time dude was forced to resign, by the way, to make way for a promised bureaucratic house cleaning. The Army, meantime, decided it better get serious about preventing battlefield trauma, even if the experts couldn't agree on what exactly trauma was. In General 2008, General Casey, the Army's chief of staff, began working with Positive Psychology Center and the University of Pennsylvania, whose director, psychologist Martin Seligman, had written such popular self-help books as Authentic Happiness, using the new positive psychology to realize your potential for lasting fulfillment. That's a long title. Well, happy early birthday there, Carrie. Together, Seligman and the Army came up with a program they called Comprehensive Soldier Fitness. Later, it explained to Comprehensive Soldier and Family Fitness. I mean, this is the same thing as soldier hygiene hygiene included your mental fitness back in World War II. So it's just a recycling of ideas, right? Nothing new under the sun and such. The Army refers to it as CSF2. The Army hired Seligman and his center on a no bid, of course, $125 million contract to develop a new way to build resilience in soldiers. The goal was to increase their psychological strength and positive performance and reduce the incidence of maladaptive responses of the entire U.S. Army, according to Rhonda Cornum, the retired Army Brigadier General who oversaw CSF 2. Cornum, a biochemist and board certified surgeon, had been a POW during Desert Storm when she was essayed by Iraqi soldiers. CSF 2 requires every soldier to complete an annual self assessment test, and based on the score, to master one or more online training programs to strengthen their resilience. Master resilience trainers are scattered throughout Army units to provide further encouragement and training. The idea is to enable soldiers to bounce back from adversity and to grow and thrive. Sergeant First Class Eric Tobin, a master resilience trainer, told me in 2014 not to eliminate adversity. We all know bad stuff happens, but to work through those situations. Change your thoughts to be more productive in the moment. Say a buddy is killed in combat, Tobin said. My thoughts in that moment could be, shit, this guy's dead, which is going to make me feel terrible. I may freeze or may go through. Or my thought may be, we're all going to die, and that leads to freezing. If my thoughts are, that guy's dead, but I have to save the rest of us, that's going to drive a different reaction. Lean on my CSF2 training, do that battle drill and keep everyone else alive. In that moment, Tobin said, I can still function. I don't know. Sharon Saunders, the director of Army Resilience Programs, told me the training modules don't really talk about how to emotionally handle morally tough issues that might arise on the battlefield, such as seeing a buddy killed or killing a civilian. Although the mental resiliency program is 6 years old, she said we have not yet addressed the mental perspective or the psychological perspective of that particular moment. What is addressed, she said, is how do I support my own optimism at that moment? As the Army builds more programming, she said, it will be interesting to see how that connects to future PTSD. How could it not? I asked. And she shot back, that's my thinking. We are really pushing forward in this particular area to robust that, she said. The good stuff is yet to come. The Army CSF2 and similar programs by other military services were studied in 2014 by the IOM sober graybeards, who cast a bleak eye on all of them. Observing the lack of evidence that any of them actually work, the majority of DoD resilience prevention and reintegration programs are not consistently based on evidence, the IOM said. There has been no systematic use of national performance measures to assess current DoD screening programs. In short, these outside experts said the Army had no way of telling whether its resiliency programs were effective or a total waste of time and money. Veterans and families frustrated by all of this have found some leverage in Congress, which has been hounding the Pentagon and VA for failing to care for the troops. Congress has forced the VA to adopt such reforms as adding new mental health caregivers and increasing research into war trauma. Some individuals have taken direct action. In the years after his son's suicide, Jeff Sexton worked tirelessly to try to find some ways to improve the military's mental health services. He wrote letters, heard nothing back from the Indiana National Guard, received polite letters from the Army and Defense Department officials. We are sorry for your loss. We're working on the problem, as per usual. But as far as anyone doing anything, Jeff said, nobody, ever. Then one day he heard his new senator, Indiana Democrat Joe Donnelly, talking about the need to do something about military suicides. Jeff sat down and wrote an email. What's up, Chino Nino? Good to see you here, buddy. Dear Senator Donnelly, me and my wife know all too well the pain of military suicide. Our son Jacob took his life in October 12th, 2009. I'm glad to see you talking about the suicide rate among our service members. For too long, I felt the military has tried to hide the facts from everyone and not to let the true cost of 10 years of war be told. I'm willing to help you in any way I can. All you need to do is ask, and I will be there by your side and tell anyone who was willing to hear how a young man takes his own life and leaves the ones he loves behind, and how his PTSD did not go to the grave with him, but passed on to his father. The next day in farmland, Jeff's phone rang. The number indicated the call originated from a Senate office in Washington. This is Joe, a deep voice said. I want you to come to Washington. In late 2004, the Jacob Sexton Military Suicide Prevention Act, sponsored by Senator Joe Donnelly and Senator Roger Wicker, Republican of Mississippi, passed Congress and was signed into law by President Obama. It required the military to give annual mental health assessments and to all service members, strengthened privacy provisions for those seeking psychological help, and directed Pentagon to experiment with giving training and responsibility to sergeants to monitor the mental health of their troops. All were measures that might have kept Jake Sexton alive and helped veterans like Darren Doss manage their own demons. As I dug into stories of people like Darren Doss and Jake and Jeff Sexton, I began to realize the breadth and depth of the moral blows that American troops were absorbing. I felt angry that we were sending them to war without any emotional protection, spiritual armor, apart from the threadbare homilies about punishing the terrorists of 9/11 or fighting them over there so we didn't have to fight them here at home. There seemed to be no grand purpose that might justify the damage being done. to them. Years ago, I had written some about the doctrine of just war. I never heard any grunts mention it, but I thought it might apply to the two wars. I went back and reread, and what I found was surprising. Chapter 5, Just War. That's where we'll end it today. I'm going to go back and look at 8 of these starred comments, and maybe we can talk about. You Misty, you typically can see it in somebody's eyes. You can see somebody suffering. It's a and in Vietnam definitely produced a lot of vets with PTSD. I have to say, I mean, for the most part, that's what I hear. I have been lucky with the care I've gotten at the VA. I'll knock on wood for that one because you never know. Let's see. Veterans that need help to find help outside the VA, then make the VA. Yeah, I agree with that, Justin. And I think a lot of people think that that's the way to go, but then you run into a whole fraud, the potential for fraud by caregivers, right? To like they do with Medicare and Medicaid, right? But obviously, we saw in this chapter that um, the VA committed fraud when they were caught not being able to keep up with their end of processing claims. This goes back as far back as 77. My granddaddy was in the VA hospital while my grandmother had surgery. He never came home. He passed away there. Man, I'm sorry, Linda. That's got to be tough. See, my daughter has this mentality and has distanced herself after coming home from Iraq. That's tough, Kathy. Definitely send in prayers then, because I mean I get the isolation and um, anger, but I'll isolate from people all the time. So um, she's in our thoughts for sure. So it's interesting. Fear is always present, in my opinion, when things happen to or around me. It was almost a relief in some ways. Yeah, yeah. I mean, that, you hear me and Jeff talk about it. Is it you have that addiction to things going on, right? So, all right. Does anybody have anything before we sign off? We have a live plan, a Hill Pirate for over here. Right now it's at 7:45, but if Shiz goes on with Kaiser stuff will flex, but just keep an eye out for that. So, and we'll keep this up. We're gonna keep driving this train. Maybe not like Casey Jones, but we'll we will keep driving it. Thank you all for being here. We had a good number in here today. See 19 of you still here. On your way out, if you would please hit that like and subscribe. Thank y'all.